Man who never earned more than minimum wage in his entire life died with $8 million sitting quietly in the bank. Around that exact same time, a Harvard-educated finance executive, a man who had spent decades professionally managing other people's fortunes, stood in front of a bankruptcy judge with nothing left. Nobody ever accused the janitor of being a genius. Nobody ever accused the executive of being careless or unqualified. And yet here they were, on completely opposite ends of the exact same story, in the exact same decade. If you have ever felt like you are bad with money because you are not a numbers person, or because you didn't go to the right school, or because you don't come from money, this video is going to change the way you see the entire game. Stick with me, because this story gets stranger the deeper you go. Hi, I'm Nora. I spend way too much of my time studying the psychology behind money because honestly, almost nobody actually teaches us this stuff properly. We spend years learning how to solve for X in an algebra class, but nobody ever sits us down and explains why two people from the same country, living through the same decade, with completely different educations and completely different careers, can end up switching places by the time their lives are over. One ends up wealthy. One ends up broke. And it is almost never the person you would expect. So today, I want to walk you through one of the most genuinely jaw-dropping real-life examples of this that I have ever come across. Two men, same era, same country, two almost mirror image lives, and two completely opposite endings. By the end of this video, I think you're going to look at your own money habits a little differently. Let's call this a tale of two men. One of them spent his entire working life sweeping floors and pumping gas at a small-town station. The other one spent his life inside Wall Street boardrooms, luxury real estate, and an 8-figure lifestyle. Now, if I asked you right now to bet which one of these two men eventually died a multimillionaire and which one ended up in a bankruptcy courtroom, you would probably bet the obvious way, based on everything society has taught you about success. And you would be completely, embarrassingly wrong. That's exactly why this particular story has been quietly passed around by financial educators, teachers, and psychologists for years. It quietly breaks the one assumption almost everyone makes about money without even realizing they're making it. The assumption that being smart and being wealthy are basically the same skill. They are not. They have almost nothing to do with each other. And once you actually understand why, you'll never look at a job title, a diploma, or a fancy resume the same way again. Let's start with the first man, because his beginning honestly could not have been more ordinary. He was born into a farming family in rural Vermont that did not have much money at all. He was actually the very first person in his entire family history to graduate from high school, which back then was already considered a meaningful achievement for a family like his. When World War II broke out, he didn't stay home. He served overseas in North Africa and in Italy, doing his part like millions of other young men from small towns across the country. When he finally came home from the war, there was no dramatic reinvention of himself waiting for him. No college scholarship, no special training program, no family business handed down to him, no connections in a big city. He simply needed a steady job to support himself, so he found one, and he got to work. For the next 25 years of his life, he pumped gas and fixed cars at a small local service station, the kind of place where everybody in town knew your name. Later in life, on top of that, he also picked up part-time work as a janitor at a local department store, pushing the same mop cart down the same quiet aisles, night after night, year after year. There was absolutely nothing glamorous about either job. No stock options, no year-end bonus, no corner office with a view, no LinkedIn headline to brag about, just a modest, steady paycheck, week after week, decade after decade, for over 40 years combined between the two jobs. Here's what actually made this man unusual, and it had nothing to do with his income. It was entirely about what he chose to do with it. He lived so far below his means that even the people who knew him personally had absolutely no idea what was quietly happening behind the scenes of his finances. Friends remember him driving the exact same small second-hand car for years on end, long after most people would have traded it in. When his winter coat eventually started falling apart at the seams, he didn't go out and buy a new one. He simply pinned it back together with ordinary safety pins and kept right on wearing it through the next winter, and the one after that. Into his 90s, he was still splitting his own firewood by hand to heat his home, instead of simply paying for oil heat like most of his neighbors did. None of this was because he couldn't afford better. He absolutely could have. It was a lifelong habit, almost a personal philosophy, of never spending money simply because he happened to have it sitting in his account. Ronald investing. Now here's the part of this story that almost nobody expected, and honestly, the part that changes everything. Whatever small amount of money he had left over at the end of each and every month, he quietly, consistently put into shares of well-known, stable, boring companies. Nothing exotic, no day trading, no cryptocurrency speculation, no hot stock tip whispered to him by a coworker at the gas station. Just ordinary, unglamorous blue-chip stocks, purchased a little bit at a time, and then left almost completely alone for years, sometimes decades, at a stretch. He wasn't trying to get rich by next year, or even by next decade. He was quietly playing a game that was measured in half a century, not in days or weeks. And because he almost never touched that money once it was invested, it had exactly one thing working powerfully in its favor, something that no amount of intelligence, no fancy degree, and no insider information can ever replace: time. Decades and decades of uninterrupted, compounding time. Let's pause here for just a second before we move to the second half of this story, because I want the first half to really sink in. We have a man with no degree, no financial background, no high income, and no lucky break of any kind, who spent over 40 years doing two of the most overlooked jobs in America. And through nothing more dramatic than living modestly and investing whatever was left over, completely undisturbed for half a century, he ended up quietly wealthier than the vast majority of people who spent their entire careers chasing wealth directly. Keep that picture in your mind, because we're about to meet someone who did almost everything society tells us to do correctly, followed every conventional signal of success available to him, and still, in the end, ended up with nothing at all. Ronald Reveal. When he finally passed away at the age of 92, the people who thought they truly knew him got the shock of their entire lives. This quiet, unassuming man, who spent his career fixing cars and mopping floors for a living, who wore a safety-pinned coat well into old age and split his own firewood by hand deep into his 90s, had quietly built a personal estate worth more than $8 million. Local reporters covering the story actually had a genuinely hard time finding anyone in town who had ever suspected it. Neighbors who had waved to him for decades were completely stunned. Even people who considered themselves genuinely close to him, who had shared meals with him, had absolutely no idea what he was sitting on the entire time. Ronald legacy. He didn't spend it on himself. He never bought a mansion. He never bought a luxury car. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone with all of that quietly accumulated money. Instead, in his will, he left the vast majority of his fortune to his local hospital and to the town library he had grown up visiting, along with a meaningful portion set aside for his own family. Think about that for a moment. A man who never earned anything close to a large salary in his entire working life ended up single-handedly funding a hospital expansion and a library renovation with money that had grown quietly and invisibly in the background, decade after decade, while he personally continued to live exactly like nothing had changed at all. Transition to Richard. Now, let's meet the second man in this story, because his life could not have started out looking more different. Just a few months before our humble janitor quietly passed away, another name was making headlines across the financial world for a completely different reason entirely. And on paper, absolutely on paper, This next man had every single advantage that our janitor never once had access to in his entire life. Richard background. This man graduated from Harvard with an MBA, one of the most respected business degrees on the entire planet. He went on to build a genuinely impressive career in the finance industry, eventually rising all the way to become a senior executive at one of the most recognizable, most prestigious financial firms on Wall Street. He wasn't just quietly successful behind the scenes. He was the kind of very public success story that business magazines absolutely love to write about. A well-known business publication once listed him among the top 40 most successful young professionals under the age of 40 in his entire industry. The former head of his own company publicly praised him by name for his business judgment, his leadership skills, and his personal integrity. Richard's success. By the time he reached his 40s, he had already achieved what most people spend an entire lifetime chasing and never quite reach. He was successful enough, and early enough, that he made the deliberate choice to retire completely from his executive career in order to focus instead on philanthropy and personal projects, the kind of retirement most people only dream about. Think about that contrast for just 1 second. One of these two men was still mopping floors and pumping gas well into his 60s and 70s, with no retirement plan to speak of. The other man had already made enough money to walk away from his entire career by the time he turned 40 years old, decades ahead of almost anyone else in the country. Richard lifestyle. With that level of success firmly behind him, he naturally started living a lifestyle to match it, the way most of us probably would in his position. In the mid-2000s, he took out large loans in order to massively expand his home, located in one of the wealthiest towns in all of Connecticut. By the time the renovations were finally finished, this single house had 11 separate bathrooms, 2 private elevators, 2 full swimming pools, and 7 individual garage bays for his collection of vehicles. Just maintaining this one property, keeping the lights on, the pools heated, and the staff paid, cost more every single month than most American families earn across an entire year of work. The crash setup. For a good while, this all seemed to make perfect, logical sense. He had the elite degree, the impressive career, the glowing resume, and now the enormous lifestyle to prove it to everyone watching. But there was one critical detail quietly hiding underneath all of this visible success, one thing that most people on the outside simply could not see. Exactly how much of it was actually built on borrowed money rather than real, liquid wealth. And in 2008, the entire global financial world was suddenly about to find out, in the most brutal way possible, exactly how fragile that particular kind of paper wealth can really be. The crash. When the 2008 financial crisis finally hit with full force, it didn't just put a small dent in his finances, it completely and totally wiped them out, almost overnight. Because so much of his enormous net worth was tied up in heavy debt and in hard-to-sell assets like sprawling real estate, he had almost nothing genuinely liquid left to fall back on the moment the market violently turned against him. He reportedly told a bankruptcy court quite plainly that he had absolutely no income left at all at that point. First, one of his properties was formally foreclosed on by the bank. Then, not very long after that, the massive Connecticut mansion, the one with the elevators and the 2 pools, followed the exact same painful path into foreclosure. Reflection. Take a moment and really imagine being a financial advisor back then, handed both of these case files side by side with all the names removed. On one file, no college degree, a career total of 2 blue-collar jobs, a modest fixed income for over 40 straight years. On the other file, an elite Ivy League MBA, a senior executive title at a globally recognized firm, an early retirement in his 40s, and a personal net worth in the tens of millions. If you had to bet your own life savings on which one of these 2 anonymous case files would still be financially secure 20 years later, which one would you have picked? Almost everyone, including plenty of professional financial advisors, would have confidently picked the second file. And that instinct, as reasonable and as widely shared as it feels, is exactly the instinct this story is here to quietly, patiently dismantle, one detail at a time. Comparison. Now here is the single detail that makes this whole story almost impossible to forget once you hear it. Both of these events, the quiet death and the very public bankruptcy, happened within just a few months of each other, in the very same period of American history. One man, with no college degree at all and absolutely no formal financial training, quietly left behind an $8 million fortune, built one modest paycheck at a time across an entire lifetime. The other man, with a Harvard MBA and an entire career built specifically around understanding money at the highest professional level, ended up with almost nothing left to his name at all. Think about the sheer size of that gap for a second. The gap between their education, their measurable intelligence, and their professional financial training was absolutely enormous. And in the end, none of it actually mattered. So what actually explains something this counterintuitive? It really does come down to one simple truth that almost none of us are ever properly taught in school. Doing well with money is not primarily a test of raw intelligence. It is, first and foremost, a test of behavior. Our janitor never needed to understand macroeconomics, interest rate policy, or market cycles. He genuinely only needed exactly two consistent habits: spend meaningfully less than you earn, and then give your investments enough time to grow without constantly touching them. Our executive, on the other hand, understood financial markets at an extremely sophisticated professional level, probably better than 99% of the population. But all of that expert knowledge didn't protect him from one very human, very common weakness: the powerful temptation to expand his lifestyle to match his rising success, and to borrow heavily against a future that he simply assumed would always keep climbing upward. In a strange way, his professional expertise may have even worked against him here, because deep familiarity with a market can sometimes breed a dangerous level of overconfidence in your own ability to predict what it will do next. Luck versus skill. Now, before we go any further, I do want to be fair here, because it would be a little dishonest to pretend luck played absolutely no role in either of these outcomes. Some real part of it truly was luck, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. The specific decades our janitor happened to be investing in did include some historically strong periods for the stock market overall. And the specific year our executive happened to face a liquidity crisis was, without question, one of the single worst possible years in modern history to be holding heavy debt. But here's the important distinction. Luck can explain a piece of the size of the outcome. It cannot explain the overall direction of it, not even close. Even accounting generously for luck on both sides, the underlying behavior, patience on one side, and overextension on the other, is still doing almost all of the heavy lifting in this story. And honestly, that's actually the more useful way to think about luck in general. You can't control which decade you happen to be born into, or which year a crisis happens to hit. But you can absolutely control how much you save, how long you leave your money alone, and how much debt you choose to take on. Focus your energy on the part of the equation you actually have power over. Why unique to finance? And honestly, here's what makes this genuinely strange the moment you stop and actually think about it. This exact kind of story basically cannot happen in almost any other profession on earth. You would never, ever hear about a janitor performing open-heart surgery better than a Harvard-trained surgeon, no matter how many decades he practiced quietly on the side. You would never hear about someone with zero engineering training designing a safer suspension bridge than a licensed structural engineer with 30 years of experience. In almost every other serious field of expertise, formal training and specialized knowledge reliably produce better, safer, more predictable outcomes. Finance is one of the very few areas of life where someone with absolutely no formal training at all can consistently and repeatedly outperform someone with the best education that money can possibly buy, simply because of patience, discipline, and long-term behavior. Audience engagement. Before we move into what you can actually take away from this, I'm genuinely curious about something. If you had to guess, right now, before I tell you the actual number, how much money do you think our janitor was actually earning during most of his working years? Take a second and picture an honest number in your head. Most people, when they hear this story for the first time, guess far too high, because we naturally assume a fortune this size must have come from a fortune-sized income somewhere along the way. It didn't. And that gap between what people instinctively assume about a fortune like this and what actually quietly happened behind the scenes over 50 patient years is really the entire point of this story, and honestly, of this whole channel. Objection. Now, I already know what some of you are thinking while watching this. That's a nice story, Nora, but I don't make anywhere near enough money to invest like that. And I completely understand that reaction because it's a fair one. But here's the part of this story people tend to skip over. Our janitor never had a high income either. For most of his working life, he was earning close to minimum wage. He didn't get rich because of how much he earned. He got rich because of how consistently small the gap was between what he earned and what he spent, and because he protected that gap for over half a century without interruption. The amount matters far less than most people assume. The consistency, sustained quietly across decades without a single dramatic interruption, matters enormously, enormously more. Reframe. So if you've ever felt genuinely discouraged about money because you think of yourself as not a numbers person, I really want you to sit with this story for just a moment longer. That was never actually the real requirement, not even close. Nobody on earth needs a finance degree, an MBA, or a Wall Street career to quietly build real wealth over time. What you actually need is something much simpler, and honestly, something far more boring than anyone on social media wants to admit out loud. Consistency, sustained over a very long period of time, and the personal discipline to not let your spending automatically expand every single time your income does. Starting late. And if you're sitting there thinking, well, this is great, but I'm already in my 30s or my 40s or even later, so haven't I already missed the window that made this story possible? I want to gently push back on that a little. Yes, time is genuinely the most powerful ingredient in this entire story, and starting earlier is always better. There's no getting around that math. But the honest alternative to starting today isn't going back in time and starting 20 years ago. The honest alternative to starting today is simply starting even later, next year, or the year after that. The single best time to build this habit was decades ago. The second best time is today, right now, this afternoon. Takeaways. So let's actually make all of this practical, because a good story means very little without a plan behind it. First, automate your savings so that spending less than you earn isn't something you have to rely on sheer willpower for every single month of your life. Second, choose simple, well-understood, boring investments that you genuinely intend to hold on to for decades, not something you're secretly planning to flip for a quick profit in a few weeks. Third, actively resist the powerful urge to expand your lifestyle every single time your income goes up, because that one specific habit alone is what quietly, methodically destroyed a Harvard-educated executive's entire fortune. And fourth, and maybe most importantly, give it real time. The wealth in this story wasn't built in one single lucky year or from one clever trade. It was built across an entire uninterrupted lifetime of simply refusing to stop the process once it had started. None of these 4 steps require a Harvard degree, a Wall Street salary, or a single lucky trade. They only require the willingness to keep doing something unglamorous for a very long time. CTA Outrow. At the end of the day, your future self isn't sitting there waiting for you to suddenly become a financial genius overnight. They're simply waiting for you to stay consistent, month after month, year after year, for a lot longer than feels exciting or rewarding in the moment. That's really the entire secret hiding inside this story. And it was never actually a secret at all. It was just quietly boring, which is exactly why so few people ever talk about it. If this story genuinely shifted the way you think about money, even just a little bit, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because every single week I break down one more true story exactly like this one, and turn it into a lesson you can actually put to use in your own life, starting today, not someday, not next year, today. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the very end, and I will see you in the next one. Disclaimer. Quick note before you go, this video is for entertainment and educational purposes only, and it isn't personal financial advice. Every situation is different, so always do your own research or talk to a licensed financial professional before making any investing decisions of your own.